the recent heckling of administration officials in private settings, which has raised a vigorous debate about basic civility and the question of whether the media should condone public shaming and confrontations. Earlier this month, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was publicly heckled as she was eating at a Washington restaurant. Differences over immigration policy and family separation in particular emboldened protesters to camp outside Nielsen's home, blasting audio of a crying child. But the issue came to a head last week when the owners of a Virginia restaurant asked White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders to leave because they disagreed with administration policies. That exchange was reportedly polite, but Sanders called it part of a troubling trend.
We are allowed to disagree, but we should be able to do so freely and without fear of harm.
That call for civility touched off a public debate that spilled over into the media, where plenty of voices condoned the confrontations.
You'll make choices in life, and there is a cost to being an accomplice to this cruel, deceitful administration.
Opinions like that were echoed in the Washington Post and the New York Times, where Michelle Goldberg wrote, "If White House officials don't want to hear from the angry citizens they're supposed to serve, let them eat at Trump Grill." And Boston Globe columnist Renee Graham dismissed the notion of civility altogether, calling it a buzzy word for the ultimate goal, submission. Okay, but here's the problem with angry mobs. Sometimes they come after you. I found myself being surprised, even though virtually every one of these people who was sort of condoning this behavior were columnists, that anybody would suggest that that kind of confrontation was okay, because to me it's not a question of free speech, it's about harassment. And that kind of harassment can sometimes lead to a more physical or violent confrontation. I mean, I couldn't believe that I was hearing people say they thought it was okay to harass Kirstjen Nielsen or throw Sarah Huckabee Sanders out of the restaurant. I was just stunned.
You know, the difficulty about this is almost the irony, the bitter irony, is that this is exactly, as you say, connected to exactly what President Trump says when he's at a rally and points to the reporters back and essentially says to his people, a mob in some ways, that you can be uncivil to them. Yeah. And yet somehow on the other side, harassment, we should, as human beings, I think, be very uncomfortable with this, because harassment can quickly turn into incitement, and who knows where it goes from there. But I think as journalists, I think what we're seeing is virtually everybody here is who was cited in this report, excellent report, by the way, was their opinion columnists, and fine to have the opinion. I think for straight journalists, the question becomes, what is the news value of this? I think it was significant, the very fact that this got wide publicity and wide attention, and perhaps is spurring a discussion about the limits of civility. That's a positive thing, and I think journalists can help that along.
Well, you know, I remember when Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. And I don't think that that's a bad dictum to live by. It doesn't seem to me that the anti-Trump forces help themselves by lowering themselves to the level of the Trump forces, who are famous for their incivility. Like you, Emily, I'd say, you know, let the Sanders eat. I might go over and deliver a monologue on their policies while they're eating. Protest, absolutely. Protest, demonstrate. I didn't really mind the protest outside Kirstjen Nielsen's house. In the restaurant was not as, I wasn't as down with that. We need a time of vigorous protest, but I don't think that being as uncivil to each other in the process is a good idea.
Well, and I think you sort of touch on a very big problem with some of the arguments that we've heard pro or anti-civility in the last few days, which is people don't explain what they mean by the term. It's a squishy term, so people can argue about whether it's appropriate to have civility or not, and it's not even guaranteed that we're talking about the same thing. And I think it is totally reasonable for opinion columnists, as you said, to say, all right, here's a line that that it is appropriate to cross right now because I believe the stakes are high. It's appropriate for them to be asked, are there certain lines that should be not gone over? I just don't think we've seen that precision in any of the pieces that you cited or any of the broader discussion, and I would like to see that. I will say, just as a citizen, as opposed to a member of the media, none of this makes me optimistic about the long-term future of American democracy. I mean, it really has started to feel to me like we're at this point of unraveling. I wasn't alive in 1968, but I think it might be akin to what happened then, and maybe even a little worse.
So I'm not sure I would use the word harassment, and particularly with regard to the Red Hen restaurant situation, which was a very polite exchange. And by the way, spurred not by the owner, but by her conversation with her employees, who felt very strongly about the policies that were being visited upon them and the rest of America, and just said, hey, I don't want to serve these people. I'm
what if it was a gay couple?
Well, I don't know. I'm saying that I think, and by the way, that's the response.
The cake
people
bakers
saying the cake baker got away
Yeah.
with not having to serve.
What if
so
she
why
just
are you
wanted to
talking
use
me?
the bathroom?
I get all
these
of
are
that.
basic human needs.
I understand all of that. I'm just saying to you that the response from people who don't normally support what people are calling squishy or not anti-civility is that, all right, you can't hear me unless I respond in kind. So let me respond in kind and let you be ashamed of your behavior. I'm not saying it's a mature response. I didn't say that.
Right.
I'm not saying that it doesn't feel good beside the moment. But this is what a lot of people are talking about.
Yeah, but
right
I'm just
now.
saying to have the journalists think, and it's one thing for the restaurant owner to do it, but.
Well,
But if the restaurant owner
I just want to
doesn't-
just address one thing, and that I think it's very important not to address, and that is the concern. And I think many of them did address it, and I have this concern as well. Is that for a lot of people, just like the guy who just went into the Gazette, they hear that and it means an action beyond. It means violence.
Right.
It doesn't mean screaming at somebody. It means shooting somebody.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, whatever happened to spitting in their soup and just leave it at that?
Oh.